Some interesting notes on Christianity. Like Hideyoshi, the Tokugawa shoguns, including Ieyasu and his descendants, they did not like Christianity. They were very suspicious. And remember that one of Hideyoshi's reforms in 1587 was the prohibition of Christianity. But this ban was not as successful as Hideyoshi would have liked, because soon he got very busy with the war in Korea and Sekigahara and his death, and all these things started happening. So Christians were able to practice secretly underground. So there were lots of missionaries who were secretly they were pretending they were traders, but they were really missionaries, and they were going around and trying to convert people, especially in Kyushu. So there was a lot of underground Christian activity. So in 1614, right before the Battle of Osaka, Ieyasu issues an edict banning Christianity and prohibiting missionary activity, but this was ignored. And the reason people ignored it was because this is right before the Battle of Osaka. Ieyasu didn't have time to enforce this. He had other bigger fish to fry. So for the next 20 years or so, many Christians continued their religious activity, in Kyushu especially. But there was persecution. If you were found to be Christian, you could be persecuted. So in 1637, a young Christian from Kyushu, his name was Shiro Amakusa, he rebelled against the Tokugawa shogunate. He said, I'm going to basically rebel against them because they're persecuting Christians of my faith. So thousands of other Japanese Christians, mostly in Kyushu, this is all happening in Kyushu, which is sort of the center of Christianity in Japan, many other Japanese Christians joined the rebellion. And this is called the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637. And in order to combat this rebellion, the Tokugawa shogunate, they send an army of 125,000 people from Edo to Kyushu to go against the Christian rebels. And the Christian rebels only had 30,000 people. Very inexperienced fighters compared to the expert armies of the Tokugawa shogunate. So vastly outnumbered. And of course, the Tokugawa easily defeated the rebels. There was no chance of them going against the Tokugawa. After all, they were vastly outnumbered. Amakusa was caught and executed, and any Japanese Christian who had participated in the rebellion, or even if you were just a Christian, you were caught and you were crucified, right, publicly, or they were beheaded, or they were thrown into these boiling pits of sulfur that Kyushu has. Kyushu, there's a lot of sulfur in Kyushu, so they were thrown into those sulfur pits just for being Christians. So the Tokugawa were not messing around. They wanted to prove a point that if anybody rebels against them, this is what's going to happen to you. And these are some images of Shiro Amakusa holding his cross. And if you can see their placard, their flag, was an image of a Christian cross. And this is their attempt to go against the Tokugawa, which ended up in disaster. And so, in order to make of course, there's really no way for them to find out if you're Christian or not. So, in order to catch underground Christians, the Tokugawa had this very interesting system that lasted for basically 200 years after this, until the end of the Edo period. They would force many people in Kyushu or elsewhere who were suspected of being Christians. They would have these kinds of mats of Christian images, either Jesus or the Virgin Mary or other religious artwork, and they would force you to step on them or spit on them or defile them in some way. And whoever refused to or could not do it was then exposed to be a Christian and was executed. And this is an image of such a scene where you have a magistrate who's looking over suspected Christians, and they're all being forced to trample on these images. They're called fumie. And if you can do it, then okay, you're not a Christian, fine, you're off the hook. If you can't do it or you refuse to do it, you're a Christian, you're going to be put to death. So this happened for the majority of the Edo period, although a lot of Christians hid their faith and they did it, but a lot of people couldn't, and they were thus exposed. So after the Shimabara rebellion was subdued by the Tokugawa, and after a lot of Christians were executed, Shogun Iemitsu sends out an official national proclamation which prohibits and bans Christianity. Okay, and other people Hideyoshi did this too, but Iemitsu takes it one step further. In addition to banning Christianity officially, he also enacts what is called the National Seclusion Policy. And what in Japanese it's called sakoku. And what national seclusion policy means is, from the 1630s on, Japan is going to be closed off and isolated from the rest of the world. What does this mean? Ships coming from foreign countries are going to be turned away from Japanese ports. If you want to come land in Japan to trade or do whatever, you're going to be turned away. Japan is not accepting anything from the West. Okay? If you are a foreigner in Japan, you could be a missionary, you could be a trader, you could be anybody. Foreigners are expelled from the Japanese islands. You're no longer allowed to be here. Get on your ship and go back home. We're closed off from the rest of the world. Japan only keeps trade relations with China and Korea because of their long historical relationship. But all other Europeans are banned. The Portuguese are out. Spaniards are out. English are out. You're not allowed to have anybody in here. Leave Japan, and if you bring any ships here, you're going to be sent away permanently. The only Europeans who Japan still engaged in trade with were the Dutch, the Netherlands. Okay, and there's a reason for this. The Dutch were Protestant as opposed to the Catholic Portuguese and Spaniards. And so the Dutch Protestants were less involved with missionary activity. They were not Jesuit priests like the Portuguese, for example, so they didn't care at all about conversion. Also, the Dutch were excellent merchants. Okay, they could care less about converting to Christianity or colonizing. All they wanted to do was trade and make money. And making money is good for the Japanese, so Iemitsu makes an exception. He allows the Dutch to be the only ones to sort of override this national seclusion policy. But there's a catch. The Dutch were not allowed to travel inside Japan, so they could not travel freely. You couldn't leave, you couldn't go to Japan and go to Edo or go to Kyoto or go to Osaka. You couldn't do that. You were forced to be on one small artificial island, which the Tokugawa constructed, off the coast of Nagasaki, which remember is like the big port city of Kyushu, that's where the Europeans were centered. So there's this artificial island that's constructed off the coast of Nagasaki known as Dejima. Okay? So all the Dutch people in Japan were confined to Dejima, and they were not allowed to travel outside. Okay, if you were Japanese and you wanted to travel with the Dutch or meet with the Dutch, you would have to go all the way to Dejima and meet with them there, and then leave. The Dutch could not leave Dejima at all. Okay, sometimes they were given permission to meet with the shogun once a year or so, and they were guided to Edo from Nagasaki, but they were not allowed to freely travel inside Japan. If you were Dutch, you had to stay and do all your trading in Dejima. If you were Japanese and wanted to trade with them, you had to travel all the way to Dejima as well. So this was the only exception to the national seclusion policy. And the national seclusion policy basically isolates Japan from the rest of the world for 200 years, from 1630 to 1639 or so, I believe, to 1853. It was completely isolated. And so now that people couldn't trade with the Europeans anymore, except the Dutch, but that wasn't on such a huge level anymore, right? The Japanese domestic economy improves because all the money is going to be spent inside Japan by the Japanese for the Japanese. The money's not going to be traveling outside of the country anymore. So that's why artisans and merchants, who are the bottom two social classes in the Edo period, that's why they became so powerful and wealthy during the Edo period, because all the money is going into their hands and all the money is being spent in Japan by the Japanese for the Japanese. So the economy domestically really improves during the Edo period.